I'm Helen Slinger, and I'm Executive Director at the Prince's Accounting for Sustainability project, A4S, where our purpose is to transform finance to deliver a more sustainable future. As chair of this session, I'm delighted to have with me Alexandra Lewis, Group Treasurer and Director of Pensions at National Grid, and David Gregg, Head of Corporate Finance at Yorkshire Water. Both National Grid and Yorkshire Water are long-time members of our A4 CFO Leadership Network teams to help us business as usual. So just a few housekeeping points before we get into the session proper. For audience Q&A, there is a toolbar at the bottom of your screen with one of the tabs for Q&A. Throughout the session, please feel free to submit any questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to those as we go along. You can get engaged with the ACT on social media, join the ACT's active LinkedIn groups, or follow them on Twitter at ACT Update and tweet using hashtag ACTAC20. You can also follow A4S on social media, on Twitter at Prince's A4S, or LinkedIn at the Prince's Accounting for Sustainability project. Also to note, this session is being recorded and will be made available for replay on the event platform shortly after the session finishes. So, as communities and businesses around the world grapple with COVID-19 recovery, it's crucial to remind corporates and investors of the need to strengthen the sustainability and resilience of their financial practices. While each of these may be at different stages on their journey, sustainable finance is fundamentally transforming corporate finance. Today, we will hear from Alex and David, sharing their thoughts on what the key driving factors are in the transition and what the major considerations should be when developing a new framework for sustainable finance. So, Alex, I'll start by coming to you. Please with us what sustainable finance means to you, to National Grid.
Thank you, Helen, and good afternoon, everyone. As Treasurer of National Grid, I've asked myself the question, is responsible business my business? So should I, as Treasurer, be involved in responsible business and sustainability matters at National Grid, or should I be leaving that to my colleagues in the business? Where can Treasury as a function add value from the point of view of ESG? So for me, everything starts with purpose, vision and strategy. National Grid, as you probably know, owns the electricity transmission and gas transmission networks in the UK. We also own gas and electricity networks in the northeast of the US and a renewable business in the US, as well as interconnectors connecting mainland UK to Europe. So we bring energy to life, and the aim of National Grid is to be at the heart of a clean, fair and affordable energy future. Now that purpose, that vision connects with our customers, it connects with our investors, and I'll talk about them a bit more in a moment. And it also connects with our employees, with me. And of course, all of our employees are doing very different things to drive that vision, to drive our strategy. If I was asked, what I did for a living, I used to say I'm an accountant, or I work in Treasury, or if I was feeling a bit more loquacious, I move cash around and I manage FX risk. Now, if someone asks me what I do, I say I work for National Grid. I bring energy to life. So understanding how the Treasury team fits in and delivers on ESG is, to me, extremely important. So why does this matter to investors? Well, it's partly a cultural shift I think we've seen in society over the past decade. So people are much more focused on climate change, on the climate emergency, also on fairness in society, fairness between different groups within society. But it is, of course, also to do with financial returns. So the focus on ESG started with equity investors, and they were concerned about the sustainability of their dividends. And now, even though the credit risk that fixed income investors are facing is different from the earnings risk that the equity investor looks at, and also the time horizons that fixed income credit investors are thinking about are different from equity investors. Fixed income investors are very, very engaged on how ESG impacts on their investment and their risk. And if I look back 2 or 3 years, if I was meeting with a debt investor, maybe 1 in 10 of them would have asked me about ESG. Now we don't wait to be asked. We're out on the front foot with it. It's included in our presentations, and you can just see on this slide. I mean, there are various graphs that can be shown of this, but this just shows how the assets under management, assets owners over the past decade or so have really been focusing much, much more on ESG, on responsible investment than we've seen in the past. So what is the role of Treasury in all this? Well, engaging in the debate is now, I think, a must. It's not a maybe. If you look at companies disclosing data on ESG, they are driving better returns than those who are silent on it. And that's even when they haven't got the best story to tell. Treasury obviously owns relationships with 2 of the key stakeholders for any company. One is the rating agencies, and of course they are focusing on credit risk and on the ESG impact on that, but also on access to capital, where companies are getting their cash and cost of that capital. And then of course there's the lenders, banks and debt investors. And it's about transparency. It's about investors needing to know and understand the story. But it's a two-way thing. It's about Treasury bringing in the views of investors on ESG, on the disclosures that they need to understand ESG. And of course, Treasury is there to think about the sustainable finance options. There's green financing, which is where National Grid has really started out on this journey. But there are other options, of course, open, and it's about keeping track of what's happening in the market in relation to these things. So what's National Grid been doing? Well, our business clearly plays to the E part of ESG. We have specific projects where we're putting stuff into the ground that is enabling the energy transition. So for us, a use of proceeds approach really made sense. It isn't for everybody, but it's where we wanted to start. And we wanted to take a holistic approach. So as a regulated business, we are issuing out of operating companies and holding companies across the group. We're issuing in the dollar market, in sterling, in euros, in different bonds and loans. So we wanted one framework that really sat across the group and sat across what we were doing in this space. We also wanted to be very, very clear up front about what was in the green financing framework, what could be financed via that framework, and about what we were not including. And for us, we definitely have excluded gas investments because we didn't want to be accused of greenwashing. But clearly gas is a big part of our business, and it's a big part of our ESG story, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We set up a green financing committee where we sat with colleagues from Treasury, core finance, but also from the business and from sustainability teams, so that the projects that we were evaluating and selecting were absolutely in line with what we were actually doing within the business. And the last thing I think to focus on is around impact reporting. So National Grid hasn't published its first impact report yet. We're planning on doing that later this year. But we definitely are focusing on using existing metrics that we're already tracking. Obviously, two benefits from that. One is the admin around it, so we're not creating new metrics that we are then needing to manage and monitor, but also, again, making sure that we are properly aligning with where the business is going. So I think my message to you is that Treasury must be at the centre of this discussion. National Grid last week has published a responsible business charter, and we've set out long-term goals and commitments across 5 different pillars that I'm showing here. And then from next year, we'll start reporting against our progress against those commitments in our first responsible business report. And just yesterday, we held an investor seminar for both equity and debt investors on the subject of ESG across our business. So our focus on this will only increase as we go forward. And yet at the same time, the Treasury is needing to finance the group. We issue around £3 billion of debt each year to either refinance maturing debt or to fund growth. And of course, not all of our business is green according to the definitions we've set out in our green financing framework, but it all does have an ESG story around it. And I think it's really important that we set out, the narrative of that to investors. We're very transparent about what we're doing. So in relation to our gas business, for example, we're replacing leak-prone pipe. We are researching into hydrogen and green gas and how cleaner gas, renewable gas can go through our pipes. We're thinking about carbon capture and storage, the future of heat, and really how gas fits into a net zero world. So to sum up, I think ESG is a risk that the Treasurer needs to monitor and to manage. And you need to understand how it applies to your own company's agenda, and then how you talk about that to people who are lending you money.
Thank you, Alex. And I couldn't agree more with your key message there, that for treasurers engaging in the ESG debate, it is now a must. And great that you made that link back to returns as well. Now, David, as you know, I'm a proud Yorkshire girl myself, so it's always great to hear how colleagues over at Yorkshire Water are embracing sustainability and making Yorkshire, the world, a better place. How does your business ethos translate into the Treasury function? Over to you.
Thanks, Helen. So, David Gregg, Head of Corporate Finance at Yorkshire Water today. And, excellent. What I'm going to do is just give you a run through of our purpose and strategy, give a bit more colour about Yorkshire Water that's driven our approach on sustainable financing over the last 2 years. And what's been a fascinating and interesting piece of work, and for me, being in the company for now just 2 and a bit years, to really learn a lot more about what we do day to day in meeting the needs of our customers across the region. So up there, you have a snapshot of who we are, what we do. Of course, you'd expect us to have all the pipe work in the ground and the treatment works to service customers, collecting and treating over 2 billion litres of water and waste a day. But a couple of other bits I think quite relevant. We are a large landowner in the region, second only to the Crown. And that includes land with tenant farmers and also land available for recreational use around our catchment areas. Also, we are a major employer in the region, directly and indirectly through our supply chain and our contract partnerships. So really the customer bills you see there in terms of what it costs for water just cover a lot more than the supply of water. So there we go. On sustainability, why is it so important to us? And I think the thing to say here is that we see Yorkshire Water as an anchor institution for the regional economy, given our role and the fact that, our permanent nature. We expect to be here for the long term, providing these services to the customers. This diagram is a simple one to show how we balance the provision of an essential public service, our impact on communities, and also operating as a commercial organisation that seeks to make a sustainable return. And this is all really summed up in our purpose that will play water's role in making Yorkshire a brilliant place to be now and for the future. And it's also come out of a lot of work we've done on our long-term strategy a couple of years ago, where we engaged with over 30,000 customers across the region to find out what was important to them and what they expected out of the company. And all of this is really important when we think about our long-term resilience. You know, when we consider sources of water, population growth, providing an affordable network for customers, the health and safety of colleagues and contract partners, and of course dealing with weather events, flood risks, etc., but also looking at renewable energy for the future. And a good example of that is coming up is a picture here of Hull back in 2007 after a major weather event, recognizable across the country. What I think should be understood is Hull is one of the major flood risk areas outside of London due to its topography. The impact there, as well as being economic, is social when thousands of people are evacuated from their homes and can't get back in for a while. And Hull is actually one of 5 cities as part of the Rockefeller Water Resilience Project around the world. And it sits alongside Miami, Cape Town, and Mexico City, amongst others, and looking how to deal with the challenges of water in the future, whether it's a lack of it, too much of it, and its cleanliness of it. And so the reason I raise Hull is the work we've done in the meantime, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years, of working with the Environment Agency and the local authorities to find ways to mitigate the impacts of weather events, which does sound a huge Herculean task, and it has been. One solution is to build infrastructure underneath the ground, but as we've done that in the 1990s and find that already can't cope with the changing weather events, we've looked at other solutions around greening up the city, planting trees, greening the area so there's less, when the rain comes, there's less water hitting our network off hard surfaces, but also upstream to reduce the flow of flood water coming down into Hull. There has been some infrastructure as well. We've got some huge pumps there. And all this meant last year when we had a big weather event that could have caused the pictures you see there, we managed to avoid it. Doesn't mean that we've won in any way whatsoever, but it just shows what can be done going forward. So generally, what have we been doing on our sustainability agenda? Well, really in the last 5 years, a heck of a lot. The UN Sustainable Goals came out in 2015. That's around the time we started our membership of A4S. And we recognized then the major challenges we had from climate change, population growth, and resource constraints. And you'll see that on the left-hand side of some of the symbols around decision management framework that I'll come on to, our transparency and reporting with integrated reporting, and also our work recently on financing. A large part of this, though, is shown on the right-hand side with our work around 6 capitals. And this is now embedded into our strategic and investment decision-making. And what they do is they allow us to take a full view beyond financial returns by being able to quantify the impact across environmental and social capital classes as set out there. This means we've been able to go beyond traditional finance-based assessments and look at alternative solutions, possibly to traditionally engineered solutions, and do that with confidence. Not that we're making the right decision, but we can also demonstrate to people when we communicate to them. And as you can see there, there's a number of documents under there that shows how we've communicated out to the world through our strategy documents, our contribution report that gives a total impact value add assessment, which was issued 2 years ago, our resilience strategy for dealing with the challenges of water, and more recently, our sustainable finance framework that was aligning our financing strategy very closely with the business objectives across Yorkshire Water. So, click. There we go. So how do we finance ourselves briefly? We have around just over £5 billion of debt, principally financed out of the London bond market, but we also tap US private placement, and we do bilateral financing as well. This allows us a flexibility of finding the best fit finance for us But there's a common theme there that our investors are long-term investors. You can see from our maturity profile there, we go out to the next 4 decades on debt maturities, and our average maturity life is around about 15 years. And when we go to market in the London bond market, for example, as we did twice last year, I would say the sweet spot for us is somewhere between 15 and 25 years with London investors. Interestingly, we did go shorter last November with an issue, a 7-year issue. And what we found quite interestingly, that started to hit the mark with European investors. And in a number of cases, or a couple of cases definitely, we secured some decent size orders from people who were just European names pulled in because of the tenor, but also because of our sustainable finance framework. It just really sort of ticked a big box for them as something for the future. So talking a bit more about the framework we put in place at the start of last year and what we were trying to achieve by it and the work we did. We wanted it to fit seamlessly in with our sustainability approach across the whole business. And like I say, that was the fascinating bit of finding out what Yorkshire Water, as a new starter essentially then, what Yorkshire Water did and where it invested its time and money and thought very long-term and very broadly in what it could do. We were seeking an ability to raise finance for a broad range of expenditures with environmental and social outcomes that were essentially, the same expenditure would give you 2 outcomes or different outcomes that were both environmental and social combined and not distinct. So we were looking at something where we were demonstrating the outcomes of what we bought rather than we put money into a specific project. And that's quite a difference, I think, to what some investors have been used to. And some of them are still adapting to that. Of course, we made sure we complied with best practices and principles, but what we then did was present beyond that compliance standard message and wanted to give the reader or an investor a clear understanding of the range of activities and outcomes that we were delivering. And we wanted to see them, long term, how Yorkshire Water was doing what it did to remain resilient. So what's next for us? Sorry, is that trying to get it to move on, please? Sorry, it's jumping around a bit on the timeline here. I'm sorry, I can't. There we go. Thank you. Whoever did that, the magic hands. So what's next? The work still goes on. There's a heck of a lot to do more on the sustainability agenda, whether it's net zero carbon by 2030 as part of a general water sector commitment. We're well on the way on converting 100% of our waste into either energy or nutrients, which we quaintly call poo power. We've just launched a solar framework that is going to make us more self-sustaining on our energy demands in the future. We've seen electric vehicles come in. Land management's a big thing for us there. Some of the pictures there about we're in the middle of planting 1 million trees. That's great for the environment, but also soaks up water and slows the flow down when there's heavy weather events. Or reinstating our peatlands and bogs, so that bottle of water is not come out of a Yorkshire Water tap basin. It's what we have to clean. And obviously, if we reinstate the peatlands, that's an easier thing to clean, and also they become more carbon absorbing. So you can see that there's still a lot of work to do. And on the governance side, we're going to bake in 6 capitals more into our corporate governance processes, KPIs, etc. On the financing side, probably in the next 4 or so years, I've got £1.5 billion to raise in the debt markets, private or public. I would see all of that as being sustainable finance under our framework and the way we set it up. I think one of the things we may look at, and it's a developing theme that's coming out, it's come out in the loan markets, it's now coming out in the bond markets, is linking the cost of your debt to your environmental or social performance. As a regulated utility like National Grid, we've got lots of measures we can use to demonstrate that, and that's one thing I think we'll look at. And then the other thing, I think, picking up on the lessons learned from last year, is to continue to communicate what we're doing, showing people that, demonstrating we are walking the talk when we go and raise the money. And so, we will be updating our contribution report later this year, and we will be continuing to work on the investor comms and ratings, and really just keep on ploughing hard at this with the Treasury team and keeping it all together. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And certainly interesting that you've highlighted you've attracted new debt investors from Europe, pulled in because of your sustainable finance framework. And a quick reminder for our audience, any questions you have, please add them in the chat function. I can see a few of those coming through already. But I'll just start with an opening question from me. So Alex, David, you've both talked about the importance of the link with strategy and for that strategy to have sustainability at its heart. But what can treasurers do if in their organisation that's not the case, if sustainability isn't a major feature in their corporate strategy? How can they drive this agenda forward? Alex, do you want to start? Yeah, great.
Yeah, sorry. So I think I come back to it's about disclosing data drives your story with investors. Even if the story isn't strong, it drives better returns than remaining silent. And I think the treasurer's role is to bring investor views back into the company. Various investors, we've seen PIMCO comment around this and the importance of ESG, BlackRock, Amundi. So, and the banks are focusing on this as well. So it's about bringing that external view into the company, I think, and saying, look, this is something our debt investors are wanting. How can we deliver that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree. I think it's demonstrating, even if it's a specific project or whatever the value. I think climate change obviously is rising up the agenda more and more, and naturally, and in terms of rising up the agenda on a broader range of companies. And I think, as Alex says, being able to raise finance. I think if you look at the capital markets or the loan markets in 5 to 10 years, there'll be a different perspective totally on them. Thinking through these sustainable areas, definitely. And I think that's the message. As we've demonstrated, nothing happens overnight. This takes a lot of work sometimes, these developments and these projects, and it's thinking in the same vein, thinking the long term. And it may be small beginnings. It may be something, a particular project or something like that. And maybe if you're a big property owner, you put solar on it and start to put in 1 or 2. Or if you've got a large fleet, what can you do there? But making a start and demonstrating it, because I think the funding requirements will change in the next 5 to 10 years, definitely.
Yeah, and obviously the treasurer needs to be on the front foot with that. Great. So until recently, conversations on the role of treasurers within sustainable finance would very much have centred around green bonds. But it feels to me like, things have very much moved on. It's now so much broader than that. What are your reflections on this and how has it influenced your own debt raising? Maybe David, I'll come to you first with this one.
Well, if I sort of reflect on the experience the last couple of years in Yorkshire, I think, green bonds was, we have a huge natural resource there. Green is naturally the way you think for a water company and what we do. But I think when I sat down with our head of sustainability and sat down and just said, tell me, first few months I was in the company, tell me about sustainability in Yorkshire Water, just start from scratch, treat me like I don't say this often, like an idiot, just teach me as ignorant. And it's been fascinating to see everything we've done across the piece, and understanding the social element and the engagement with customers, and meeting the needs and requirements of that. And that really just shaped for me that if we were going to align with the strategy and the approach and the ethos of the company, we should do it. We should go all out. And that's probably quite easy for us, given the work that had been before myself turning up since about 2015. So I think it is, green's getting a lot of attention, and climate change, and that's getting a lot of attention, and quite rightly so. But I think longer term sustainability, I think, has a stronger message when you think of long-term resilience of businesses and demonstrating that to investors, definitely. So I think green is a very good stepping stone on the way. We sort of leapfrogged that because we could, in a way, with all the work we've done beforehand.
Thank you. And Alex?
Yeah, clearly at the moment, as I said earlier, we're issuing green bonds. And the reason for that really is that it fits into what we do as a company. So I suppose I would say there are lots of options. Sustainable bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, green RCFs. Starts with where your business focus is, and thinking about that in the broadest ESG sense, and then having your financing strategy follow that.
Great. And you can find some examples of those sustainable RCFs and different types of sustainable bonds in the A4S Essential Guide for Debt Finance, which you can find on the platform in the supporters section under A4S. So some questions from our audience. In developing your sustainable financing framework, what have you learnt that would save grief for other treasurers?
So shall I kick off on this? The big thing is to work with the business. So make sure you're aligned with what your own business is doing. Make sure they are being brought into the conversation. It's not a silo where you're thinking, right, Treasury, we're issuing debt. Let's sort this out amongst ourselves. You've absolutely got to reach out and get the business joined with what you're doing.
Yeah, I think be curious and ask questions, because it's amazing what sometimes is going on in the business. I think I always do anyway, as a treasurer, just to, as a treasurer, we've got to know what makes a business tick, how it earns its money, how, it ensures its future. And I think also, the one thing was, again, was try and get a sense of the big picture of what we're trying to achieve. And we went all out for the holistic approach and quite a sort of, we didn't sort of go down a conventional route that we thought to get this launched. We sort of go down something like project or capital asset finance or whatever. We decided to go all out and then think that through in the big picture way, and our second opinion provider, talking broadly to them what we were looking to do and make sense of it before we actually dived into the detail. Have a view of what the end product's going to look like and how you wanted to shape it. And we went, like I say, quite all out and, very pleased with the result we got and actually the response we got. I think that was the thing when we launched it and did our first bond, the response we got back on what we were presenting for the company. We were seeing this as another element of our sort of general communications alongside all the other things we share with the outside world. So I think that's the other bit. Sometimes that can take a bit of effort to get it through and get it done with other teams, communication teams and documentation, all this sort of stuff, but it's worth it. That is definitely worth it at the end.
So perhaps a little bit additional effort, but the response that you get is totally worth it. Great to hear.
Yeah, bang's worth the buck.
Yeah, fantastic. So what impact has the EU taxonomy had on your sustainable finance frameworks, if anything?
I'll kind of try to take the first two ones. Not much at the moment. I think our framework came into play, as I say, at the start of last year. So I think it's great to have a taxonomy there, something that for such a large market such as the EU, put some sort of clarity there, because there is a lot floating around and standards and principles. I think the EU's got the clout to actually establish something that everyone can recognise and perhaps drive forward. To be honest, have we been through it line by line? No, not yet. But I think when we come to review our framework next, probably early next year, we'll do a sense check. I think, I'd be surprised if we're out of kilter anywhere. But I think it's a good step forward. It's a pity it just takes so long. I think they started this back in 2015-16, didn't they? So, it's taken 4 good years. Those, and if you think about climate change, those are 4 lost years that, could take a lot of hard yards to get back. But glad it's there in a way, and it's going to be a good reference going forward.
Anything to add, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, when we pulled our green financing framework together, so it was sort of last summer and autumn, we were definitely looking at what the expert group was saying around the EU taxonomy, and we took account of that when we were pulling our criteria together. So I think we did look at where it was going. We've excluded fossil fuel gas business from it. And just to echo what David said, it's ongoing, and when we update our framework, which we can do, we want to keep it a living document, we want it to be moving with the times, as it were. So we will look to sort of make sure that we're taking that into account.
So not yet, but it will be coming when you both refresh your frameworks. Okay. We touched a little bit on, what that would now save grief for other treasurers. Just interested in, whether there's any other key challenges that you've come up against and how you have overcome them, either internally, the process side of things, or externally with how you communicate it.
I think internally, there was one I was very well aware of. If we'd gone down a different route to holistic, which was actually extracting and maintaining detail, if you were going on a process of financing specific projects to show that, use of funds and management of funds, etc., was segregated. With the holistic approach, we've been able to sort of manage that. I think the one for me going forward is externally, that there is a lot of good talk about sustainable finance, green finance, and I'm comparing that and CEOs' letters that might be out there from big fund managers, the actual, when you meet a credit analyst on a roadshow or on an update, etc., how much are they talking about it, sustainable finance? How much is the message permeating through there on what's going on and why we're doing it? And you get a mixed bag, and I think that's quite, that's telling me there's a way to go there on the capital market still. And I think, I'm involved with our pension scheme, and we've definitely got ESG coming through there, and there's a criteria to assess our investment managers by. So, I think that's it's not caused us any challenges too much, but it's something where you've just got to keep on going at it and keep on getting the message out. And I think over time that will naturally flip in terms of the emphasis that more investors will be interested in what we're doing and appreciating the value of it than there are today. And I think that's the one that I picked up from last year, and the one we know we've got to work on with our comms, and also with our ratings agencies, because they're all starting to warm up to ESG now. But I've yet to have a in-depth discussion with, I'm covered by it for my sins, all three agencies, and I've yet to have a sort of a session on sustainable finance, say, that would be 10 or 15 minutes of a review, for example. Yet they are starting to assess companies along those lines. So I think that's the other aspect, where to join it up a bit more and make sure people get the message.
Yeah, that's certainly what we hear, is that they are certainly upping their efforts on ESG and the extent to which it informs their decisions. And question here on biodiversity, which is quite an interesting one. What are the developments in biodiversity that have caught your attention, and do you anticipate that they will find a home in your sustainable financing frameworks anytime soon, or are indeed they already there?
So, ours definitely is. I mean, one of the projects that we've included, or we will be including when we do our first impact report, is around biodiversity and the visual impact that we have on the countryside, and how we're undergrounding cables to kind of improve the environment in that respect. So it's something we absolutely are thinking about, and the impact we have on the environment in that way.
Yeah, and for us, I think less grey pollution, the more green solutions will naturally encourage biodiversity. But I think the other bit to note is, as I said, we're the second largest landowner in the region. We have tenant farmers who we sort of encourage them to look at alternative ways of farming that we support them with as well, to encourage biodiversity, and also restoring the bogs and peatlands up in Yorkshire. As I said, we get cleaner water out of it to treat, not so brown, and it becomes a carbon trap as opposed to a carbon emitter. But also the biodiversity just naturally, just springs up when you create the right conditions. It naturally comes back, and so I think it's already in what we do. Has it been a big driver? No, it's just happening. It's just what we do, and the way we think about managing land as well as supplying water. And it shows, I guess, the breadth of what we take on, as I say, taking responsibility for.
Great, thank you. And we've probably got time for one final question. So many of those listening today won't be as far along as you are in this space. So what would be your top tips for those starting out? What should be the first thing that they should consider?
Well, I think it comes back to what David said about being curious, understanding your company's strategy, reaching out to your colleagues, making sure you understand the agenda, and then thinking about how you talk about that with your investors. These things take time, as we know. The net zero target is 30 years away, but there's always a first step. There's always the first things you're doing, and how you think that through, and think about your financing strategy sitting around that, I think is really important.
Yeah, I just echo all of that. I think even if there's nothing on the company strategy now, long term there has to be. I think if you think of climate change and what's going on, and it may be little things, but if it's not there, the one thing I counsel against is trying to launch a framework without any substance behind it. In terms of trying to sort of demonstrate or show there's something there that may not be, substantial or tangible, because I think that reputation-wise, it would be a big knockback. So, look for the opportunities on the back of what the business or company is doing. If it's not doing something, then there's a question there. What's its future going to look like in 10 years down the line, or whatever, in terms of its resilience, its cost base, etc. Because these are going to start permeating through. Climate change, carbon, etc. All those costs are not going to stay where they are today.
So
Sorry, Helen. I just thought as David was talking. Investors drive the strategy, and strategy drives the financing strategy. So there is something circular here about how Treasury needs to fit into this. But I don't think you should be seeing a change in your company strategy because you've raised green financing. It's more about aligning your financing strategy to what the business is doing and what the investors are asking for. Sorry, Helen, cut across you.
No. So I guess to sum up, then, be conscious of where treasurers fit within that sphere. Start with climate and build out, and make sure that there's substance in there. That's what I heard. So thank you to both of you. So big thank you to both Alex and to David. I'm sure that all of our audience will agree the insights they've shared were both very inspiring and helpful. And thank you also to you, our audience, for your valuable contributions, which have helped to make this an engaging session. You can find further resources on integrating ESG into your debt finance, and in particular on developing a finance framework, as I mentioned earlier, in the supporters section of the event platform under A4S. I'd like to remind you that you can watch this session again on demand. As with all conference sessions, it will be made available for replay on the event platform shortly and for 30 days after the event. You can also continue the discussion and chat directly with fellow attendees within the networking lounge. Please pay a visit to the virtual exhibition hall, where you can find more information on this subject matter and many others. And if you get a chance, complete the session survey, which is located next to the Q&A box on your screens. And we hope to see you at some of the other live stream sessions later today. Thank you.